Hello again. I want to think a little this morning about how attitude can alter how successfully people live their lives. Or to be more precise, I want to examine just one aspect of this vast subject upon which I touched in an earlier video today. Have a look at the thumbnail to this video, which shows a Chinese man who was born in Singapore. You've never heard of him. His name was Bao Yin. In England and America, he changed his name and became one of the most successful authors in Britain, as well as being a Hollywood screenwriter. The television series based on his books brought success for a man who went on to become one of Britain's most famous actors. You didn't even know that the man who wrote the books on which that series was based was Chinese. His pen name was Leslie Charteris, and of course he was the author of the Saint books, featuring Simon Templar. Roger Moore played the title role in the TV series, and it was this which led on to his becoming a very successful film star in later years. The interesting thing about both the books and television series of The Saint is that it's all about English people, and there is no mention at all of racism in it or any stuff about prejudice against the Chinese or anything like that at all. Nobody even knew they'd been written by a Chinese guy. Isn't that weird? Let's look now at a few black authors in Britain and America, some of whom came to those countries from elsewhere and others who were born there. I'm a great fan of Buki Emejita, an Igbo woman who came to England in the 1960s. She wrote two really brilliant books published in the early 70s, one called Second Class Citizen and the other In the Ditch. Both were about racial prejudice and the experience of being black. I enjoyed too Alice Walker's The Colour Purple, which is about racial prejudice and the experience of being black. I could go on and list black authors in Britain and America, but they all seem to have one thing in common. Their books are about being black. In fact, I can't offhand think of a black author from those two countries who has written a book where blackness is not integral to the plot. Compare this with the Saint books of Leslie Charteris. Simon Templar, the Saint, is a white Englishman, and there's no mention of racial prejudice or the experience of being Chinese in the books. Charteris carved out a fantastic writing career for himself without mentioning being Chinese at all. Perhaps he didn't suffer from racism, though. Maybe that's something that black people suffer from more. Well, of course, actually he did. Because he was Chinese, although he lived and worked for years in Hollywood, he couldn't get permanent residence in America because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which specifically does not allow Chinese people to settle officially in the country. He knew as much as anybody about racial prejudice. What we see in Leslie Charteris and his success story is nothing to do with intelligence or racial prejudice. It has everything to do with attitude. It is this same attitude which enables Koreans and Chinese to get on so well in the United States. Instead of being obsessed with the whole idea of being black and a victim of racial prejudice, those from East Asia tend to get on with their lives and do the best they can. I have never heard of Chinese people wanting special help or raving on about inclusion or diversity. You won't hear Sikhs or Hindus doing that either. This may go some way toward explaining why there are so many Chinese and Indian success stories in both Britain and the United States, and so few among Africans and Caribbeans. We all know about the wealthy Indian businessmen who came to England in the 1960s or 70s with not a penny to their name. Through hard work, they became multimillionaires. There are similar stories to be told about Chinese people who fled Vietnam in the 1970s and became successful in Britain and America. Does anybody offhand know of a Caribbean multimillionaire who came to Britain penniless in the 1960s and by his own efforts became vastly rich? No? What you see here is precisely what you observe in Leslie Charteris. It's an attitude which tells them that nobody owes them a thing, and that if they are to get on, then they'll have to overcome obstacles like racial prejudice and poverty by their own efforts. You see this clearly in the academic success of children from Chinese families at school and university. When black children fail at school or get suspended or excluded, their parents are very prone to blame racial prejudice on the part of the teachers. When a Chinese kid doesn't do well at school, the parents assume it's because their child is lazy or inattentive. I'm sure that we've all seen the so-called Asian dad memes referring to this attitude on the part of parents from East Asia. It is one of the reasons that so many Chinese Americans managed to get into Harvard that a quota system has been established with the aim of keeping their numbers down. At the same time, Harvard and Yale have a system which sets aside a certain number of places for black students who wouldn't otherwise get a place there. So in other words, they're trying to keep out Chinese students and at the same time make it easier for black students to get in. All this has nothing to do with IQ. And although there may well be differences between ethnic groups, but that's another question. What this is about is attitude. The attitude that made Leslie Charteris so successful and also means that hardly anybody, even now, 30 years after his death, even knows that he was Chinese.